All right, chess fans, get ready, because today we are diving deep into the mind of a true chess master.
We're talking about Edward Lasker and his incredible book, Chess Strategy, written all the way back in 1915.
Over a century ago. Is it even relevant today with computers analyzing millions of moves per second?
That's the fascinating thing. The game itself hasn't changed that much, so the principles Lasker lays out are still surprisingly relevant.
Okay, so for someone like me, not a beginner, but definitely not a master, what's the biggest takeaway?
Lasker would say stop obsessing over memorizing every opening and start thinking about the why behind your moves.
So more about strategy than just memorizing moves.
Exactly. He uses this really cool analogy. Imagine chess like a math problem where each piece has a numerical value.
So like a pawn equals 1 and knight equals 3, that sort of thing.
Yeah. And he gives us a great example from an actual game. Let's say you see a pawn that's being attacked 3 times, but it's also being defended twice. Even if those defenders are stronger pieces, the attack has a numerical advantage.
Hmm, that's interesting. You'd think a well-placed bishop would be stronger than a couple of attacking pawns.
Right. That's where understanding the value of each piece comes in. Lasker says a rook is generally worth a minor piece plus a pawn or two, and the queen, well, that's the powerhouse equal to 2 rooks. So you can't just count the pieces. You have to weigh their strategic value as well.
Okay, this is more complex than I thought. So we've got this numerical advantage idea, and then the actual value of the pieces. What else should we be thinking about?
He's really big on mobility, how easily your pieces can move around the board to control key squares.
Hmm.
Think of it like having options in a choose-your-own-adventure book. The more mobile your pieces are, the more paths you have to victory.
That's a great way to put it, and that's got to be especially important in the opening, right, where you're setting up your whole game.
You got it. He has a whole section about avoiding what he calls lost moves in the opening. He uses a game Morphy played to illustrate this. Morphy actually gave up a material advantage early on, but he still totally outmaneuvered his opponents because he developed his pieces more efficiently and took control of the center of the board.
So it's more about long-term strategy than just those flashy early moves. It's like building up a base in a game of Risk.
Precisely. And it's not just about what you move, but where you move it. He gives this really clear example of how moving your pawns forward too early can weaken your king's defenses.
Oh man, I know I've made that mistake. You always hear push those pawns, but it sounds like that's not always the best plan.
It's all about thinking long-term. A strong pawn shield can backfire if it creates weaknesses that your opponent can exploit later in the game.
This is making me rethink my entire chess game. So we've covered mobility and avoiding those lost moves in the opening. What happens when we move into the middle game?
Now, that's where things get really interesting. Lasker brings it all together, positional play, anticipating your opponent's moves, knowing when to exchange pieces to your advantage. One of the most fascinating things he talks about is the idea that sometimes sacrificing a piece.
Wait, you're saying there are times when you should intentionally give up a piece? That seems crazy.
I know, it sounds wild, right? But Lasker says that a well-timed sacrifice can be the most powerful move you make. He gives this incredible example from a game between two masters where one player sacrifices their queen.
The queen, the most powerful piece on the board.
Yep. And it totally throws the opponent off balance, opens up this line of attack that leads to checkmate a few moves later. It's risky, but when it works, it's like magic.
Okay, now I need to hear more about this. This is why I love these deep dives. You always give me a whole new perspective.
That's what Lasker would have wanted. He saw chess as more than just a game. It was a way of thinking, a model for tackling any kind of challenge in life.
You're saying we could use these principles of strategy, thinking ahead, even sacrifice in other areas of our lives.
Absolutely. And you know what? We're just scratching the surface here. Lasker goes even deeper into things like the psychology of chess, and his insights on the endgame are pure gold, but we'll have to save those for next time.
All right, listeners, you heard it here first. We're just getting started with our deep dive into chess strategy. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to the deep dive, everybody.
I'm still thinking about that queen sacrifice. Lasker wanted us to be chess ninjas, making these big, bold moves.
He wouldn't like that word ninjas, but the bold moves, yeah. He really thought chess was a way to train your mind for any challenge. One thing he talks about a lot is that it's a conversation.
Not out loud, of course. But like every move is saying something to your opponent.
Right. You're thinking about how they'll react, planning your next move, trying to stay a few steps ahead.
And speaking of thinking ahead, we can't forget about Lasker's insights on endgames.
Ah, the endgame. To be honest, I always found endgames a little, anticlimactic. After all the excitement in the middle game, it's just moving a few pawns around until someone gets checkmated. You're not the only one, but Lasker would want you to think again. He thought the endgame was the most crucial part. Even if you're down to just a few pieces, there's still so much room for strategy. He makes a good analogy. Imagine two armies after a long battle. One might look stronger, but the one with a better understanding of the terrain, their supply lines, the morale of their troops, that's the one that will win.
I could see how that applies to chess.
Ah.
What does that look like in an actual game? Any specific examples?
Oh, yeah. He has a whole section on king and pawn endings. It might sound simple, but it's full of traps and opportunities. One thing he talks about is the opposition. So let's say your king is right in front of your opponent's king.
Blocking its path. Sounds pretty straightforward.
It seems simple, but that position, that opposition, gives you control of important squares and forces your opponent to make bad moves. Lasker has this great example with diagrams where he shows how you can use just one pawn to force a checkmate if you do it right. It's about precision patience and seeing those little advantages.
I wish I'd read this book years ago. It would have saved me so much trouble. But how does this stuff translate to real life? How does thinking like a chess master help me with my career, for example?
That's where Lasker is really brilliant. He connects these chess concepts to everyday life. He'd say that developing what he calls a chess mindset can help you in any situation, negotiating a raise, leading a team, even just making a tough decision.
Okay, I like the sound of that. What does this chess mindset look like?
Well, it starts with analysis. Just like you wouldn't make a move without looking at the board. Lasker says we should approach every situation with a critical eye. What are the factors? What are the possible outcomes? What are the risks and rewards? He tells this great story about a businessman who used this kind of strategic thinking to save his failing company. Instead of making quick decisions based on emotion, he took his time, analyzed the market, figured out his competition and his company's strengths. Then he made a long-term plan, making calculated moves just like a chess master, and eventually it worked.
Like the saying, slow and steady wins the race. But it's not just about being slow, it's about being smart.
Exactly. And it's more than just analysis, it's about anticipation. In chess, you're always trying to think a few moves ahead, figure out what your opponent will do. Lasker would say you can do the same thing with your career. Don't just react to what's happening. Try to predict trends in your field, see potential problems and opportunities before they happen.
So be proactive, not reactive.
Right. And that leads to another part of the chess mindset, learning from your mistakes. Lasker was all about analyzing your losses. He'd probably say something like, don't be afraid to lose. Be afraid to not learn from losing. Every mistake on the chessboard or in your career is a chance to get better, refine your strategy, and come back stronger.
So true. But that's easy to say and harder to do. It's easy to get discouraged by setbacks, whether it's losing a chess game or hitting a wall in your career.
For sure. But Lasker would remind us that even the best chess players in the world lose sometimes. It's about changing your perspective. Don't see those losses as failures. See them as feedback. He tells this amazing story about a game he lost to Capablanca, who many consider one of the best chess players ever. Lasker spent hours going over that game, not because he was upset, but to figure out the subtle mistakes he made, the missed opportunities that led to him losing. And you know what? That process of learning from his mistakes made him an even better player.
That's really inspiring. So he's saying setbacks will happen, but they don't have to define you. It's how you respond to them, how you learn and improve that really matters. And, speaking of responding to challenges, there's one more part of Lasker's chess mindset that I find really important, especially now, patience.
You got it. Chess really makes you be patient. You have to think long-term, resist making impulsive moves, wait for the perfect time to make your move. Lasker talks about this constantly. He even says that patience is more important than talent for a chess player.
That's a bold thing to say. So in this world where everything is so fast-paced, how can we cultivate that chess patience?
Lasker would say it's about recognizing that progress isn't always a straight line. There will be setbacks, times when you're not moving forward. But those are the times when patience is most important. Just like in chess, sometimes the best move is to wait. Watch, let the situation develop, and then when the time is right, you strike.
I like that. Trust the process, even when it feels like you're not getting anywhere. You're still learning, growing, getting closer to your goal.
Exactly. And that ties into another big part of Lasker's philosophy, positional play. He considered it the foundation of good chess. Basically, positional play is making moves not just to attack or defend right away, but to make your overall position on the board better, to control key areas, to limit what your opponent can do, to slowly squeeze them out of the game.
So playing the long game, even if it means making small moves that don't seem important at first.
Exactly. Lasker would say that a lot of big achievements in life, whether it's a successful career, a great relationship, or even just becoming a better person, are the result of consistent, patient positional play. It's about making those small but important choices every day that slowly move you towards your goals, even if you don't see the results right away.
I love how he takes these chess concepts and connects them to something like building a good life.
And you know what's interesting? Lasker connects this idea of patience and positional play to the psychological part of chess.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. I'm ready for the mind games. What does psychology have to do with chess?
Well, for one thing, it's about reading your opponent. Not just their moves, but their habits, their weaknesses, how they're feeling. Lasker was a master at this, watching his opponents, noticing when they were frustrated or unsure of themselves, and then he'd use that to his advantage. In his book, he talks about how he once noticed that one of his opponents would get really nervous when his queen was being attacked. So even if it wasn't the best move strategically, Lasker would make sure to threaten his opponent's queen just to get in his head. The pressure of potentially losing his most valuable piece caused his opponent to start making mistakes, and eventually he lost.
Wow, that's next level chess. But how would that work in, say, a business meeting? Should I stare down my boss until they crack?
Not exactly, haha, but the idea is similar. It's about developing that awareness, that ability to understand what people are thinking and what they're vulnerable to. In a negotiation, if you can tell when the other person is feeling confident or insecure, eager to make a deal, or ready to walk away, you have a big advantage. You can change your approach, just like Lasker adjusted his strategy based on what he knew about his opponents.
So it's about paying attention to those subtle cues that people give off, even when they don't say anything.
No, you got it. It's not about manipulation, it's about understanding. It's about using that understanding to communicate better, build relationships, and find solutions that work for everyone.
This is really making me think. So Lasker is saying that chess is like a mini version of human interaction, a way to understand not just the game, but ourselves and the people around us.
Precisely. And that brings us to one of the deepest and often overlooked parts of Lasker's teachings, the idea that chess isn't just a game, it's an art form.
Art, you mean like those giant chess sets they have in parks? Or those really fancy chess pieces you see in antique stores?
Those are definitely artistic, but Lasker meant something more than that. He believed that a really well-played chess game, especially at the highest level, was beautiful, a work of art that went beyond the board and the pieces themselves.
Okay, I'm listening. How does a chess game become art?
For Lasker, it was about the elegance of the strategy, the way the moves all fit together, the way a skilled player could combine all these different elements, tactics, strategy, psychology, into a unified, beautiful whole. He describes one game between two legendary players as being so beautiful, so well played, that it made him cry. He said it was like watching a perfectly choreographed dance, a symphony of movement and thought that left him speechless.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. But I get what he means. There is something beautiful about seeing a well-executed plan, a series of moves that flow together so perfectly.
Yeah. And like any art form, chess requires more than just technical skill. You need creativity, imagination, the ability to see things differently and create something new, something unexpected, something that surprises people.
So it's not just about following the rules, it's about bending them,
Yeah.
even breaking them sometimes to make something truly original.
You got it. That's what makes chess so fascinating. It's both old and new, simple and incredibly complex, logical and creative. It's a game that challenges you intellectually, emotionally, even spiritually if you let it. And in that way, it really is like a mirror to life itself.
This conversation has been so eye-opening. I feel like I'm learning about chess and about myself, about how to think, how to learn, even how to live.
Yeah.
But before we go too deep into philosophy, I have to ask. You mentioned that Lasker was a big fan of specific openings. Can we talk about some of those?
Of course. Let's start with one of the most famous and controversial openings, the King's Gambit. It's a bold, aggressive opening that Lasker himself played really well. He even wrote a whole book about it.
All right, let's hear it. For those of us who haven't mastered the King's Gambit yet, can you give us a crash course?
In the King's Gambit, white sacrifices a pawn on their second move, usually the f-pawn, to try to gain an early attack and control the center of the board. It's a risky move, but it can lead to some really exciting games.
That sounds like my kind of opening. But I'm guessing there's more to it than just giving away a pawn and hoping for the best.
Definitely. Lasker always emphasized understanding the reasoning behind an opening, not just memorizing the moves. He focused on developing your pieces quickly, maintaining a strong center, and creating threats that force your opponent to defend.
So don't just follow a set of rules. Understand the strategy and adapt it to what's happening in the game.
Exactly. That's what's so great about chess. There are so many possibilities. Even well-known openings can have surprising results. Now, Lasker also really liked the Queen's Gambit, which, even though it's called a gambit, isn't really a gambit.
Wait a minute, you're going to have to explain that one. How could it be called a gambit if it's not a gambit?
Chess terminology, right. A real gambit means sacrificing something, usually a pawn, to get a better position or tactical advantage. In the Queen's Gambit, white offers their c-pawn on the second move, but they can usually get it back or at least develop their pieces and get a good position.
I get it. So it's more of a clever pawn maneuver to get an early advantage.
You got it. And Lasker studied this opening in detail, exploring its variations and pointing out the key strategic ideas that come up. He was really interested in how the Queen's Gambit can create complex pawn formations, which can really impact the rest of the game.
So it's not just about those first few moves, but how they shape the pawn structure and the whole strategy of the game going forward.
Precisely. And Lasker was amazing at understanding those long-term consequences of every move, every pawn structure, every little detail. He saw the interconnectedness of everything, recognizing that even the tiniest things could change the outcome of the game.
That's wild. It's like he could see through the game and understand the underlying principles that make it work.
Exactly. And he was able to explain those principles in a way that was insightful and interesting, making even the most complicated chess concepts understandable to everyone.
He's definitely opened my eyes to how deep and complex the game is, and I'm sure our listeners feel the same way. This deep dive into Lasker's chess strategy has been awesome so far. We're getting close to the end of this part, but I have to ask, are there any other openings Lasker liked? I'm curious about the less common ones, the ones that might surprise us.
You're in luck. Lasker loved learning about the game, and he believed that every opening, no matter how unusual, had something to teach us some hidden strategic wisdom. One opening that he found really interesting, and one that often surprises opponents, is the bishop's opening.
The bishop's opening. I got to be honest, I'd never heard of that one. Sounds kind of different to say the least. Tell me more.
Different is a great way to put it. Unlike a lot of popular openings that focus on controlling the center of the board with pawns, the bishop's opening is about developing your king's bishop early in the game, usually to the by-5 square. It might seem like a weird move at first because the center of the board is where all the action is, right? But Lasker knew that sometimes the best strategies are about challenging the usual way of thinking about finding those unexpected lines of attack that your opponent won't see coming.
So it's about throwing them off guard, making them think outside their usual game.
Exactly. When you play the bishop's opening, well, it can put a surprising amount of pressure on black's position, especially on the queen side. It can lead to some really sharp and unbalanced positions that are tough for both players to handle. But as Lasker would say, that's what makes chess so great. Those complex and dynamic positions where creativity and strategy are most important.
That's the truth. And speaking of creativity and strategy, there's something else about Lasker's approach to chess that I find really fascinating, his focus on the psychology of the game. We talked about this a little bit before, but I'd love to hear more about how he used psychology to get an edge over his opponents.
Great question. Lasker's grasp of psychology, both his own and his opponents, was a huge part of why he was such a good chess player. He understood that chess wasn't just about the moves on the board, it was also about mental toughness and emotional strength.
So you're not just playing the board, you're playing the other person.
Exactly. And Lasker was amazing at it. He would really watch his opponents, picking up on their little habits, how they reacted to certain moves, how they acted under pressure. He was like a detective looking for clues that would reveal their weaknesses, their insecurities, their thought patterns.
And once he found those weaknesses, he'd use them against them.
Well, not exactly. Lasker wasn't about playing dirty or being manipulative. He believed that true mastery in chess meant understanding your opponent so well that you could predict their moves, their thoughts, even their feelings. And he used that understanding to shape his own strategy, making moves that would not only give him a better position on the board, but also make his opponent feel unsure of themselves, plant seeds of doubt, and ultimately give him a psychological edge.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
It's like he was playing chess on multiple levels at the same time. The tactical, the strategic, and the psychological. No wonder he was considered one of the greatest.
Exactly. And the cool thing is that these insights about psychology that he got from chess are just as helpful in other parts of life, in business negotiations, in relationships, even in our own personal struggles.
Give me some examples. How can we use these chess-inspired psychology tips in everyday situations?
Well, Lasker was a big believer in self-awareness. He said that before you can truly understand someone else, you have to understand yourself, your strengths, your weaknesses, how you act under pressure, what makes you tick. Just like in chess, understanding your own biases and blind spots can help you make better, more rational decisions in all areas of your life.
So it's about developing that awareness of yourself, being able to take a step back and look at your own thoughts and emotions objectively.
Exactly. And once you've got that self-awareness, you can start to understand people around you better. Like Lasker watching his opponents, you can start paying attention to the subtle things people do, their body language, their tone of voice, the words they choose.
So become a student of human behavior. Learn to read between the lines to see what people are really saying.
Exactly. The more you observe, the more you see patterns not just in yourself, but in other people too. You start to understand how different situations, environments, and types of people can lead to predictable reactions. And when you understand that, you can start to predict those reactions and change your own behavior accordingly.
That's really cool. It's like having a secret code to figure out human behavior to understand what's really motivating people.
Exactly. And it all starts with those same principles of observation analysis and strategic thinking that we get from playing chess.
I'm constantly amazed by Lasker's insights. This deep dive into chess strategy has been a real treat. But before we get to the final part of our deep dive, where we'll explore Lasker's brilliant insights on the endgame, I have one last burning question. All right, chess fans, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Lasker's chess strategy. And this is where it gets really interesting for me, at least.
The endgame. A lot of players find it the most exciting part.
I used to kind of dread it. It always felt like after all the big battles were over, the endgame was just, well, a bit of a letdown.
Yeah.
Shuffling the last few pieces around until someone makes a mistake and it's checkmate.
You know, that's where Lasker would disagree with you. He saw the endgame as the climax of all those battles. A stage of the game that's just as complex and strategically rich as any other. Maybe even more so. He actually said the endgame is where chess truly becomes a science.
A science? Wow, I always thought of chess as more of an art, especially after our last conversation about how Lasker viewed creativity and psychology in the game.
He'd agree with you about the artistry, but he also felt that the endgame required a different kind of thinking, a more precise and calculated approach. Like imagine a surgeon performing a really delicate operation. Every single move has to be carefully planned out with a deep understanding of what could happen. That's the kind of precision and focus Lasker believed the endgame needed.
Okay, I see what you mean. So it's not about brute force at that point. It's more like finesse, knowing the subtle moves that can win you the game, even when it seems like a draw is inevitable.
Exactly. And Lasker gives so much knowledge about endgame strategies. He analyzes different situations, explains key concepts like opposition, which we touched on earlier, and things like triangulation, where you move your king to control important squares and limit your opponent's options.
Triangulation. Now that sounds almost mathematical.
It is. Lasker often used geometric comparisons to explain these concepts. He'd say that in the endgame, the board is like a shrinking battlefield, and every square becomes more important. He shows how even a single pawn, if it's in the right spot, can control huge areas of the board and even get promoted to a stronger piece, which can completely change the game.
This reminds me of those really hard chess puzzles where you have to figure out how to checkmate with only a king and a couple of pawns.
Those puzzles are actually perfect examples of how even in seemingly impossible situations, the right endgame strategy can make all the difference. And of course, Lasker, being Lasker, goes beyond just the technical stuff. He connects those endgame strategies to bigger life lessons.
Okay, I'm always up for a good life lesson, especially with some chess strategy thrown in. So what wisdom does Lasker offer about winning those final battles, both on and off the chessboard?
He stresses that the endgame often requires a different kind of courage. Not the bold attacking style of the opening and middle game, but a quieter, more determined kind of courage. It's the courage to keep fighting even when it seems like you're going to lose. To stay focused and disciplined when you just want to give up. He tells a great story about a game he played when he was almost 60 against a much younger rising star. Lasker was outplayed for a lot of the game, but he stayed calm and patient, slowly maneuvering his pieces into a better position. And then in the endgame, his opponent made just one tiny mistake, and Lasker took advantage of it, winning a game that most people thought he had no chance of winning.
That's amazing. It's like he was saying, it's not how you start, it's how you finish.
Yeah.
It's about having the strength to keep going, to believe in yourself, even when things look bad.
Exactly. And that connects with another important part of Lasker's endgame philosophy, paying attention to detail. He argued that in the endgame, every move, every pawn move, every little threat becomes super important. It's those small, seemingly insignificant details that often determine who wins the game. He gives this fascinating example from one of his own games where he notices his opponent tends to move his king to a certain square when he's under pressure. Lasker sees this little pattern and uses it against him in the endgame, setting a trap that his opponent walks right into.
Wow, that's incredible. It's like he's playing four-dimensional chess, seeing patterns and possibilities that most people would never even notice.
That's a great way to put it. And that kind of awareness, that ability to see those small but crucial details, is what Lasker believed separated the good players from the great ones. And he said that this skill, like any other, could be developed through practice, through careful observation, through being willing to learn not just from your own mistakes, but from the masters.
So even if we're not all going to be chess masters, we can still use those principles of perseverance, attention to detail, and strategic thinking in our own lives.
Absolutely. Think about those times when you're facing a challenge at work or in your personal life or even just trying to learn something new. It's so easy to get discouraged, to dwell on the obstacles, to doubt yourself. But in those moments, Lasker would want us to remember those endgame lessons, to keep fighting, to stay focused, to pay attention to the details, and to never give up.
That's a powerful message, and one that I think anyone who's ever worked hard for something, who's ever faced a challenge and come out stronger, can relate to.
And that's what's so inspiring about how Lasker approached chess. He saw it as more than just a game. He saw it as a reflection of life itself, with all its challenges and victories, its setbacks and breakthroughs.
I have to say, this deep dive into chess strategy has been a real eye-opener. I feel like I've not only learned more about chess, but I've also gained a new perspective on how to approach life's challenges with more purpose, more resilience, and, yeah, even more joy.
And isn't that what it's all about? Expanding our understanding, questioning what we think we know, and finding new ways to see the world and ourselves.
You got it. So to all our listeners out there, I encourage you, if you haven't already, grab a copy of Lasker's book, Dust Off Your Chessboard, and start exploring the amazing world of strategic thinking. You might be surprised by what you find out not only about chess, but about yourself.
And who knows, maybe you'll even start winning those endgames both on and off the board.
That's all the time we have for today's deep dive, but something tells me we'll be coming back to Lasker's wisdom again and again. Until next time, keep those minds sharp and keep on exploring.